Since I was able to get this side off with the puller, as soon as I took that side off, it was real easy to remove the cover and expose the differential unit inside there. The oil, there wasn't much oil in there, and what oil was in there was clearly heavily contaminated with water. It's got that telltale smell and look to it. Looks kind of like what the oil looks like in an outdrive on an outboard if it's contaminated. And that's exactly what this stuff looks like. So, and then you get this big gear. You can see that bearing in there. Basically, the rebuild kits that you can buy for these contain the bearings, and I'm assuming probably comes with the O-ring. That's the other thing too. This O-ring is just falling apart. It's completely rotted, just little chunks. So it probably explains where all the oil that was supposed to be in there went. This little thing here kind of acts like an expansion chamber, I guess. It's got holes all through it. That actually attaches right here. So when you're going through the water and you're sinking the axle in the water, if this thing's got holes in it, of course water's just going to get all inside that case. These are 3 shims that actually go right here. They slide over this gear and are in there. And I just want to make sure that I put those back in right where they go. Because obviously the fact that there's 3 of those shims must be a pretty critical dimension, the thickness of those. And since I'm not going to be changing the gears, it should all go back together with these shims and it should be okay. Here's a peek at the side of the case that has the ring gear on it. There's the gear, and this actually has 2 shims that go right on that shoulder. I took this all apart already and cleaned it up. Gear looks like it's in great shape. No chips in the teeth. And then you've got basically a large bearing that this ring gear rides on. And then you've got a small bearing here, which is actually the shaft, the output shaft for this side rides on. Both of these bearings actually feel pretty good. So I don't think I'm going to have to replace them. There is a kit available online that contains all the bearings. If I were going to replace these bearings, before buying the kit, I would probably want to go talk to the guys at the bearing place that I buy a lot of my bearings and seals from, because oftentimes they're able to get me a good price on a replacement bearing. I was also able to find some bearings online, like wheel bearings, that are just Asian-made generic bearings, but they also say that they're a replacement for Arctic Cat part number so-and-so. So obviously I'm not the first person who's realized that you don't necessarily want to buy an Arctic Cat bearing and pay through the nose for that, when you might be able to find the actual bearing made from an Asian manufacturer for considerably less. These bearings here are Japanese made. So if I called my bearing guy up and I told him I needed a bearing and I said that it's got the following markings, this actually says, it's kind of hard to see with this camcorder. This camcorder doesn't focus on small close-ups, but there's the letters NTN, which probably is the manufacturer. Of course, Japan, country of origin. And then a nice part number right there, which is actually 16014. And then the smaller bearing in the middle is also an NTN bearing, and that's also got a part number right on it. And that part number appears to be 6005 C as in Charlie 3. So I'd be willing to bet that if I were to call him up and give him that information, he'd probably be able to source these bearings for me. And then the question is, would it be cheaper to buy the bearings individually through him and the seals, or do I want to just buy the kit and do the whole thing? I'm thinking I might just do individual bearings, just because the condition of these bearings are pretty good. The seals are another issue. This is the seal it's the outboard seal for the output shaft on this side. Presses in right like that. And that one's really toast, so definitely going to have to get a new seal. And as far as this unit goes, the actual differential as it's called, the verdict's still going to be out on that. I do know that the way it's supposed to work is basically you've got to have fluid in there, and being that there was not enough fluid in this case, it might just come down to that if I'm lucky. This area right here that looks overheated, not sure whether or not that's something that happened to this unit while it was spinning, or whether or not that's just something from the manufacturing process. But the best I can do is get new seals and new bearings that it needs, and put it all back together. And when I get my new shafts in there, hope that it works. And if it doesn't, then it means this unit is bad, because it'll be the only thing I haven't replaced. And if this unit is bad, pretty much it's going to be one of these situations where I'll be better off finding a good used complete unit for less money than what it'll cost for this new from Arctic Cat. So that's how that cookie crumbles. This bearing here, the guys at the garage, they gave it a listen, and they strongly feel that bearing should not be making that grinding noise. It's kind of hard to hear. So they recommend we replace that larger bearing. And on this side of the case, this bearing here, which actually is the bearing that supports this side of the shaft, is actually seized. It won't spin at all. Now, we're not sure whether or not that is actually something that's been that way, or is it something that happened while we were pushing on this, putting a lot of force on this. Could something have happened that actually damaged that bearing? But we'll get a new one. The part number on that bearing, that's also an NTN bearing made in Japan, and the part number on that bearing appears to be 6908C3. So got actually 3 different size bearings in this unit. This bearing here is one size, this small bearing in here is the second one, and then of course the large one that's behind here. Now once I remove the seal, the bad seal from this side of the casing, which had been also kind of pushed in from the earlier attempts, this bearing actually started to rotate, so I thought maybe it was just the seal was impinging on it and causing the problem, but it does seem a little rough, so I'm going to go through all this trouble. I don't see the point in not replacing this bearing. Back looking at the front differential case, that's the bearing in there that initially wasn't turning at all, and then after taking the badly mangled seal out, it started to turn, but it still feels kind of rough, so I'm going to replace it. So knocking that out is going to be pretty straightforward. That's just a simple matter of placing this on a good firm surface, which in order to not mar the aluminum, I'll use my bench top. And from the back side, I'm just going to tap the bearing out. I got a hunk of brass I use here as a soft drift. I don't really have to be that careful about the bearing since I'm trashing it anyways. Key is you don't need to use a lot of force. Just some decent taps, basically going around slowly. When you tap on this side and then tap on this side, that keeps the bearing from getting too cocked inside the casing, and then you're going to get really jammed up, and then it comes out a little at a time, and then it'll just pop right out. Piece of cake. Now we're going to remove this big one. This inner one is actually fine, so we're not going to replace that one. This outer one is the one that's got some nasty sounds when you rotate it. So this is the one we're going to replace. Now, that's in a blind hole, so normally it might be an issue. But because it's got such a large inner diameter, you can actually stick a screwdriver in like here and lightly pry on it until it pops just a little bit. And then go exactly opposite of that same spot, 180 degrees, and do it again until it pops. And keep doing that, and it'll slide out ever so slowly. It's actually already starting to come out. I already did it a couple times. There you go. Takes just a couple of minutes. Just don't rush it. It'll come right out. Of course, the other thing you could do is, if you don't own one, you could go to an auto parts store if they rent tools and rent a bearing puller or a seal puller and do it that way. But this was easy. This is the cover to the front differential unit. I'm going to take this small bearing out. Before I remove it, I just want to note that there is this bearing actually sits a tiny bit proud of the case right there. So when I'm going to put the new bearing in and I'm seating it, and it feels like it's fully seated, it should be sticking up a tiny bit like that, and I don't want to try and drive it any further at that point. So taking this bearing out, I'm going to lay this on a block of wood just to keep this soft aluminum from getting marred, and I'm just going to tap around the edge here and knock that right out. I'll be able to actually put this ball peen hammer fits in there nice. I'll tap on that and it'll knock that right out. Alright, this bearing came out pretty easy. This bearing is a 6005C3, in case you wanted to look it up across to a generic. If you search for that bearing number on eBay, you can find quite a few new old stock, good quality bearings for cheap. So that's what I ended up doing. So I'm actually waiting for this bearing to come in. Some of the bearings that came in off of eBay, you know, this bearing here is this is a 6908. It's in kind of a plain box, but it actually is something new old stock somebody had. This is a seal bearing, and this is a SMT bearing. This is going to be the bearing that goes on the other side of the inside of the case on the front differential. I'm going to start to focus on disassembling this input shaft section with the pinion gear on the front differential. Okay, to disassemble this, what you're going to do is you're going to take this part off, and to do that you're going to get to that nut on the shaft there, and to do that you got to remove this assembly. It's kind of a rubber deal. It's almost acts like a flex plate or a torque arrestor or something. Hardest part of disassembling this is getting this nut off. You got to hold this while you're turning it, and if you're fortunate enough to have a large vise like that one, I was able to actually tilt this, get this in there like that, clamp it, and then ratchet down on it and get it loose. Once that happens, this thing easily comes apart. You get a roller bearing up in the top here, and you get a roller bearing down at the bottom. That's basically it. Oh, of course, one last thing, as always, a seal. Getting that seal out took quite a bit of prying. Now I see why. That's one heavy duty seal. It looks like it's at least a double or even a triple lip seal. So I don't know, even if there are any numbers on this one, it might be kind of hard to source this one generically. It might be Arctic Cat OEM only, or whoever makes this drive for them. Probably Suzuki, Kawasaki, who knows. There's the tapered roller bearing that came right out. That's got a good part number on it too. That one does feel pretty bad. Well, here's some bad news. This is the part of the housing that goes into the front differential or bevel gear unit. This is the pinion gear and bearing. Actually, this sits like this, and then there's another roller bearing, tapered roller bearing, that actually goes in here. And clean this up, and we're looking at it and can actually see there's a crack that runs. Well, it's kind of hard to see with this, but there's actually a crack in there that runs right along the that edge there, and it starts like way over here and runs all the way around, and it runs all the way, almost 3/4 of the way around that I can see. And upon further inspection from the outside, can actually see that that crack is actually all the way through. So this is bad. And now I've got to go try and find one of these, and I'm going to have to try and find a used replacement, because I do not think that this part was listed on the parts breakdown. I think this is actually sold as part of the front bevel gear unit. I hope I'm wrong, but needless to say, this one is not going to cut it. Okay, I want to take this tapered roller bearing off of the pinion gear, and tried putting a puller on it and pulling it, because there's actually a point in there that the puller can ride in. Tried pulling it, and of course that just badly distorts the outer part of the bearing, this cage. So since it was going to be taken off anyways, I decided to just break it and popped out all of the little rollers, and then that way I can remove the cage altogether. And now I should be able to grab onto this more firmly with the puller and get this off. Okay, I'm trying to remove this what's left of the inner bearing race off of this pinion gear and shaft assembly. And what I did was I took the grinder and I ground a couple of grooves into two sides of it. And I'm going to see whether or not I can get a puller to actually grab onto that. And then there's a hole, self-centering hole here on the end of the shaft that'll help keep the puller guide in place. So I'm going to see whether or not I can slide this off with a puller. Alright, so here's my 2-jaw puller is set up now on this thing. And I've also got a large C-clamp that I've clamped across the puller arms just to help them from wanting to spread out and pop off the groove that I ground into that race. So we'll give it a try. It's slow going, but it's actually working. It's already moved out about 1/8 of an inch. So I'm just going to keep cranking on this and it'll pop right off. Now that I've removed what was left of the bearing on this pinion gear assembly, I can start reassembling this part of the housing. And this is the old housing. It's got that really bad crack in it. And this is the new housing that came in. I think this is about $78. Ordered it from Arctic Cat dealer, and it came in this bag, and it's a Suzuki genuine part. So the Suzuki part number is a 27441-19B00. So I think I checked online, and turns out you can't get it for much cheaper by buying it through a Suzuki dealer anyways. A little bit, but not much. But just thought it was interesting. It's a Suzuki part. And then I actually went on a Suzuki site to see what quads, Suzuki quads, this fit. And turns out this does fit front differentials on quite a few, on a few different models of Suzuki's, but all of those differentials are, the rest of the differentials quite different than the front differential on my Arctic Cat here. So this is one of the few parts that will cross over. Alright, driving in this outer race into this housing, it's kind of tricky. I managed to get it in flush pretty easily, and then I started to push it in with the old outer race. But since the old outer race is also a press fit, I didn't want to end up with a situation where it got stuck in there. So luckily I've got the old wheel bearing. One of the old wheel bearings is actually a good fit to, it's got enough clearance so it's not going to get stuck in the bore, but it's also going to still catch the edge all around, so I can use this to help me press that bearing in there. So now I'm going to put it in the vise and use a wood block to protect the aluminum. Okay, just put that in the vise with the block of wood on one end to protect that, and then this old bearing on here like that. Crank it down and seats it nicely. So now that's fully seated. Of course, that's the inner bearing is going to go in there like that later. But now I've got to get the bearing that used to go in this side, new one, which is over here. So now this one has to be installed. Now that I've got both of these races installed in here, I now have to install this bearing, which inner part of the bearing, which actually goes here. This actually has to get pressed onto this part of the shaft on the pinion gear, so that when it's inverted, the whole thing drops in this way. Alright, to help me slide this bearing, drive this bearing down into position, I'm going to use a cheap 7/8 inch half-inch drive socket. I'm just going to tap it down as far as I can. Well, that socket worked pretty well, but I could only go so far, and I need to drive it down further, so I cut a section of 1-inch copper pipe. The OD of this pipe is perfect for hitting the inner part of this bearing race, and now I just cut it in the vise, and as I tighten down in the vise, I'm using another copper pipe as leverage here to crank down on the vise, and I can actually see it sliding down. So this is going to work. Okay, here's what the gear looks like once it's fully seated. So now that is going to sit in there like that, and now this gear gets pressed on from this side down into there. Okay, I seated this tapered bearing. I used the 7/8 inch socket with the half-inch drive to drive that bearing down, and I tapped it in so that I have no free play in the shaft side to side or in and out, but I didn't want to tap it in too hard because then it'll start to cause the tapered roller bearings to bind, because the design here is that you've got a tapered bearing facing one direction on this side, and then the tapered bearing on this end is facing the opposite direction. So when they pull together by virtue of this being driven in, it can actually cause it to bind. But that's nice and free, and it sounds good, feels good. So that's how we're going to do it. Okay, after assembling this assembly, and remembering that as I was tapping this bearing down, I was concerned about how far to seat it, because if I seat it too far, this would be bound up. If I didn't seat it far enough, it had too much end play and side-to-side play of the shaft. So then I revisited my disassembly videos and also looked at the part list and confirmed that there's actually a spacer that slides over that shaft before you put this bearing in. And that spacer's job is to make sure that when you're putting this bearing in, you don't seat it too far down or too far up. So what I'm going to end up having to do is, unfortunately, I'm going to have to pop this pinion gear out, get this bearing out, get the spacer in there, and then insert that all over again. So hopefully this won't be too difficult to get out. And then also I've got to look around the shop here and figure out what I did with that spacer, because the way it looks on the parts list, it almost looks like I may have mistaken it for an old inner race of a bearing and thrown it in the scrap pile. But luckily none of that's gone out yet. So just some light blows with the ball peen hammer on the end of the shaft here as I hold it in my hand is enough to pop this free. So I've got it almost all the way out. Okay, didn't have to dig too far through my scrap pile there to find the spacer in question. And this spacer actually slides right on down there like that. And that ensures that when you seat this bearing, it's in the proper position. Okay, there's the bearing fully seated. I use that big socket again to drive that in, and feels good. So we'll go back to work on the front differential unit. This is the pinion gear assembly, all assembled, and I'm going to put this seal in. This seal actually is what keeps this unit sealed. So that's just a press fit. Okay, this seal is just a press fit. You don't want to push it in too far, because it'll bottom out on the bearing that's in there, and then the double lip seal will not properly make contact with this area here. And then once you've got that seal in, this just pops down over the splines, and then we can install this nut. Alright, now we've got that bolted on. Now I'm going to just install a new O-ring in this groove right here. Alright, I'm going to clean the case before I put the new bearing in it. It's the half of that case for the front differential or bevel gear unit. And just in the interest of being thorough, I'm going to take out these plugs also, so that when I put it back together, I can change these little gaskets or O-rings, whichever it may be, to ensure we don't have any leaks. This is an 8mm hex head, and let's see what's underneath there. It's a little flat crush, looks like a crush washer. Okay, this is the front bevel gear assembly or front differential case, and I just finished installing this new seal. Best way to get this seal in is to go in from the back side and push it out towards this way, and it's tough to get in, so it's not a bad idea to put a little bit of oil on the outside of the seal to help it get in there a little easier. It's a really tight fit with that new seal. Now that I have the new seal in there, I'm going to install the new bearing, which will go in this way, pressed in from this side. Okay, I've installed the new bearing in the front differential unit case or bevel gear unit case, and I'm going to install this differential in here. But before I do, I'm going to remove this little clip that's on here. There's a little wire clip that's on here. The reason why I'm going to do that is because the one on this side is missing. It got destroyed during the disassembly because it was stuck in there so badly that when we finally got it out, it just came out in pieces. So I'm going to take this one off so that I have one to bring with me to the hardware store or industrial supply to try and get a replacement one. And I want to make sure that's an exact size. So the easiest way to do that is just take the old one with me from this side. And I'll probably just get a couple of them. Okay, so here's what that little clip looks like. It rides in that groove right there. Popping that out's pretty easy. Just use a sharp point and pick one end out and kind of work your way around, going around, and you can pop it right off. And I'll take that to industrial supply or hardware store and see if I can't find a couple of them and replace them later when I go to put the half shaft or CV joint assemblies and shaft assemblies back on. So for now I'm going to install this differential inside the case. Okay, so that's installed. That basically just presses into the inner part of that bearing and sticks out like that. Okay, the next step is to put the new bearings in on the cover for the front bevel gear unit. This gear could actually be installed on here now. Problem is, once you install it on here, it's going to be very difficult to get the bearing, the large bearing that gets pressed in the outer part here, to correctly line up and seat. So the best way to do this is to actually install the bearings here and then push this gear down into the new bearing, and then take this whole assembly and flip it over and install it, and just rotate the shaft from the other side till these teeth engage these teeth on the inside here. So first step is going to be to install those two bearings. Installing this bearing is pretty easy. I've got a piece of flat metal stock here to keep the jaws of the vise from chewing up this aluminum any worse than it already is. And then on the back side where I've got the bearing being pressed in, I've got just a plumbing fitting that fits. It's got the right OD to allow me to push even pressure on the outside ring of the bearing while not pushing on the center of the bearing. And then I just tighten the vise jaws up and the bearing slides right in. Okay, so now this bearing is installed, and as I had noted in the original video during disassembly, this bearing actually sits slightly proud of the housing right here. So it doesn't look like it's fully seated, but it is. Okay, so now the large bearing's installed. I'm going to just clean up some of this, almost looks like some sort of a gasket compound or something, or sealant that's on this flange. What's actually supposed to seal this is this O-ring, which that's a brand new O-ring I've installed. But looks like they also put a little bit of sealant on this flange. So I'm going to clean that up and probably put a little bit of RTV on there. Okay, now I can install this gear on the cover side of the front bevel gear assembly. But before I do that, I need to make sure I install the shims that came out. There's two larger shims here that go right on this gear right here before it's installed in here. And then there's this shim set of 3 right here that actually goes right on here. Okay, now I'm going to assemble the side cover onto the front differential unit. Okay, now with the side cover installed on the differential, I'm going to install this seal. And it's just a press fit right in there. Now I can install the assembled pinion gear assembly and housing into the front differential. But before I do that, I want to make sure I put the shims that were on here, these two shims that came off of this pinion gear assembly unit, back in place, and then I'll bolt it up. Okay, I went to install the shims and they won't go back on with the O-ring in place unless I force it over the O-ring, and that might bend up the shim or cut the O-ring. So just as a note, if anybody who's doing this assembly, you want to put these shims in place before you put the O-ring in. So I'm going to remove the O-ring and install the shims and put the O-ring back on. Okay, now I've torqued down the bolts holding together this pinion gear housing assembly into the differential housing, and that should take care of that. Alright, now I'm going to install the drain plug that I removed earlier, and the drain plug here I cleaned up really well. It's got a little magnet in the center of it. And I ordered this new washer. This was right on the parts list. They actually call this a gasket for the oil plug, but it's actually a little metal specialized crush washer. And that just sticks right on there and crushes down in a very specific way to make a good seal when this is tightened. Alright, Friday afternoon, December 17th. The sun's setting. Warmed up today. I've had a cold snap here, and by warm up I mean it was in the 30s. So pretty cool out here, so I'm not going to stay out too long, but I did want to try and get something done on the Arctic Cat project today. So I'm going to finish mounting the front differential, which just means adding the nuts onto the bolts that I inserted last time I was out here, and I'm going to mount up the coupling that couples the drive shaft to the front differential, and then see if I have any time left after I do all that. Okay, I've got the housing all bolted up, and now I'm bolting in the coupler that attaches the input shaft on the front differential to this shaft that goes over to a U-joint coming out of the front of the motor. Okay, now the front differential's all bolted in, the coupling's all bolted up to the drive shaft, so that's fully installed. Now I've removed the fill plug on the differential. I'm going to make sure I've topped off the differential. I did find out that the proper fill point for the differential is just to the top of the hole here. So I'm going to add more diff oil until oil starts to come back out of the hole, and then I'm going to tighten up the plug with a brand new copper crush washer so that I don't have any leaks at that point.